All right. Thank you, everybody. First off, thanks to the folks here at Security Weekly, not only for inviting me to talk here today, but also for putting on this conference with lots of great talks. And more generally, just for the great security journalism you all produce, both in the form of your podcast network and the written articles you all produce as well. So the name of this talk is The Great Refactor, and to provide a little bit of background, I gave a version of this talk at MITRE's Attack conference in early October, and it was only a 15-minute talk, so I had to really speed through it. And shortly after that, I saw the conference submission, I saw the CFP for this conference. And I thought, this would be a great opportunity to sort of give the longer version of this talk. So I submitted it. Thankfully, the folks here at Security Weekly accepted it. And then as I was going through to actually produce the slides and the talk itself, a fairly obvious thing occurred to me, which is while I can be reasonably certain that everybody at MITRE's Attack conference has a reasonable amount of background and understanding of MITRE Attack, I probably can't make that same assumption about the audience here. So whereas I initially conceived this as kind of a deep operational dive about transitioning from the version of MITRE that predated their move to sub-techniques to the version of MITRE that includes sub-techniques, and I will provide more clarity on what that distinction means here as I go through. It occurred to me that I should zoom out a little bit and kind of talk more generally about use cases for MITRE Attack, the bits of it that are interesting, and higher level stuff about how teams can use it. So I still have a bit of the operational stuff on the back end, but I wanted to cover some of the higher level stuff too, just in case some people who are watching this aren't totally familiar with MITRE Attack. So without wasting any more time, my name is Brian Donohue. I am an intelligence analyst at Red Canary. Unusually, most intelligence analysts serve a customer or multiple customers, or maybe their customer is the security operations center at the company they work for. I actually am an intelligence analyst that sort of works outwardly and tries to provide educational resources to the broader information security community. So my purview at Red Canary is sort of covering topics that include, obviously, threat intelligence, but also threat research and all of the various implications that has, and detection engineering. So I tend to produce content relating to those three topics, whether it's blog articles, videos, conference talks like this one, or annual reports, whatever sort of content you might produce. And then I also support our open source tools, which in the context of this talk, the primary one that is relevant here is an adversary testing / simulation framework called Atomic Red Team. And I will explain in more detail what exactly that is later in the talk. Prior to joining Red Canary, I spent the first 5 years of my career in INFOSEC, and really the first 5 years of my adult career after college as a journalist at a publication you all might be familiar with called ThreatPost. After spending about 5 years there, I transitioned what I would say is a pretty light transition to a career as a cyber threat intelligence analyst. The two jobs are actually very similar, I would say. As a journalist, the onus is on you to reach out to experts to do your assessment. You're kind of a conduit for the story. Whereas a CTI analyst, you have to sort of do those assessments on your own. So the muscle you have to figure out how to use when you shift from being a journalist to a CTI analyst is sort of contributing to the story on your own rather than just being a conduit for it. So it is highly probable that either a dog will start barking or a child will start screaming during this talk. Know that I am not sorry for that. We are all locked in our homes during this time, and we will persevere if some strange noises start happening in the background. So the agenda for today. As I said earlier, I think I need to provide some background on exactly what ATT&CK is, to include things like why MITRE Attack sort of re-architected the framework to include this idea of sub-techniques, also like some common use cases for them. And I'm going to have like a kind of crawl, walk, run approach to this, although it's not going to be reflected in my slide copy because I kind of thought of this after I developed the slides. But I'm going to spend a little time on like the easiest way you can start adopting attack, and then like a slightly more advanced way, and then what I would consider the most challenging way to adopt MITRE Attack. I will have a brief sidebar in here to explain what exactly Red Canary is. Just to know that I'm not doing that because I'm trying to sell you on Red Canary. I'm doing it because I think we've done a very good job at Red Canary of operationalizing MITRE Attack at scale. And I think it's going to serve as a great example for how other security teams can kind of try to do the same thing on their own end. So I'm going to spend a good deal of this talk, though, on this idea I've got of like mapping versus modeling. So it's kind of difficult to explain here, and I'm sure it will make more sense when I get into it later in this slide deck. But basically the idea is like, on the one hand, you can adapt MITRE Attack by using it to inform like your threat model, right? Like thinking about what threats do you need to be worried about? What are relevant to your organization? Where should you be focusing your efforts on like improving security controls? And then in my crawl, walk, run metaphor, like that would be the walking phase. And then mapping to MITRE Attack is kind of that next level of sophistication where you're sort of taking your internal security controls and your internal security data, and you're aligning that with MITRE Attack for the purposes of tracking threats or producing reports, whether they're external reports or internal reporting for leadership or whomever. I also have, as a transition from sort of explaining, how you might be able to use MITRE Attack to inform threat modeling, or how you might adopt MITRE Attack by way of mapping your own controls to it. We've kind of been doing this at Red Canary for probably 2 or 3 years, the mapping side of it. And over that time, we've learned a lot. And I want to share that stuff with you. So I've got a story buried in here kind of later in the deck that is a bit exemplary of problems you might face over time as you're working with MITRE Attack. And then that last, like the operational parting thoughts / lessons learned bit is kind of going to be like, while the story is the example of like what you might experience, those parting thoughts are going to be like the ways you can try and head off those problems early or address them when they eventually arise. So without wasting any more time, let's start off with sort of an exploration of what exactly MITRE Attack is. So MITRE Attack is a taxonomy of threats, right? So it takes this like very nebulous thing, the threat landscape, and it transforms it into a finite list of tactics and techniques. And it attempts to define all of the many ways that an adversary might, like all the many techniques that an adversary might leverage in an attack against an enterprise. And I should note, as a sidebar, this is just one version of attack. This is attack for enterprise. That's what we're going to talk about throughout most of this slide deck. There are other versions of attack. So there's attack for cloud, there's attack for ICS, there's a mobile version of attack. They're all sort of analogous. We're talking about attack for enterprise because like primarily the attack that we work with at Red Canary is this version of it. But this guidance probably applies to attack for cloud and to some extent to a cloud attack for ICS as well. So as I said, it basically takes this threat landscape, tries to assign terms and definitions to all of the techniques that an adversary might use. Now, this list is admittedly not complete. Like anyone can submit techniques to MITRE Attack, and like it's an ever-growing list. However, like despite its incompleteness, it is a vast improvement over the way things used to be. And the way things used to be is that like for any threat technique, there was an unknown number of ways that people might describe it. So if you think of it, it's roughly analogous to the problem we face right now and that we've always faced with adversary naming conventions, right? Like CrowdStrike might call a group like some like Crimson Tiger or something, or Mandiant might have some like soullessly bureaucratic mix of letters and numbers to refer to an adversary group. And the federal government might have some all caps name for it. Microsoft might call it by like an element in the periodic table, right? And all of these groups are like, they're either synonymous directly or there's overlap between them, and it's all very, very confusing. So MITRE Attack tried to solve that for at least the threat technique terms, right? Like to create a standardized way of referring to all of these techniques. So as you can see, organizationally, like across the top of that last slide, sorry, I'll go back, in blue up there, we have tactics. And tactics are kind of like high-level objectives, right? So they're things like execution, initial access, lateral movement, persistence. And then coming down in columns from each of those tactics are techniques. So this version I'm showing you here is actually like a very, very old version of MITRE Attack. I don't know if anybody remembers what it was like in February of 2020, but that's when this version of the matrix is from. This is the pre-subtechniques matrix. I included in my slides because honestly, it just looks better on a slide than the parent techniques do. And then within these techniques, there's like another dimension of sub-techniques. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of MITRE Attack to me is data sources. So for any given technique in MITRE Attack, MITRE has associated data sources. So imagine that you're dealing with PowerShell and you want to know, okay, what tools do I need to have access to? What sources of log data do I need to have visibility into in order to observe PowerShell? That's what these data sources are, right? So like, first off, if you want to have a chance of like detecting or preventing PowerShell, like visibility is a prerequisite. So these are the data sources that give you visibility into PowerShell, things like PowerShell logs, process command line parameters, process monitoring, etc. Another interesting aspect of MITRE Attack is that for any given technique, the MITRE team has listed what I believe they call them procedural examples. And basically those are the threat groups or the threat campaigns that are known to have leveraged these techniques in the past. So groups are roughly analogous to adversaries, and then they also have software. So software you can think of as like the malicious tooling or the malware that's used by these groups. Question, are you seeing, what slide are you seeing?
Yeah, it still just shows up as the one that says software.
Okay, I think it's lagging a minute.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's like, it might just be our platform having some issues.
There we go.
Oh, here it goes.
Oh, didn't catch up yet. We'll wait. We can cut this.
I'll just wait for a second.
Cut it in post.
It's supposed to be on 12, right? Wait, what are... Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know what... I've never seen it act up like this before.
Yeah, it was doing a little bit when I was sort of messing around with it earlier.
Here's what I'm going to do. Well, you might do this. It would be better if you just refresh your browser. It won't stop recording or anything.
Boom. All right.
Still the same.
Cool. Can you hear me?
Oh, were you seeing it? Yeah, I can hear you.
I see. Wait, what are these sub-technique things now?
Okay. Yeah, I just refreshed too and got there. Okay, cool. So if we're good, go for it.
All right, continuing on. So, like I briefly mentioned the idea of sub-techniques earlier, and some of you, if you're very familiar with MITRE Attack, might know what sub-techniques are. Some of you, if you're just sort of dipping your toes into MITRE Attack, you might be sort of familiar, but not quite totally familiar. And then those of you who like aren't familiar with Attack, hopefully I just sort of described it at a high level, and now we can kind of jump into this idea of sub-techniques. So let's talk about the problem that led to sub-techniques in the first place. MITRE Attack is at least 6 years old. I can't remember exactly when they first released it, but it's changed and it's grown pretty rapidly over those 6 years. But one decision that MITRE has largely stuck to is like they wanted to keep the original architecture and design of MITRE Attack. And probably like fundamentally sub-techniques, the introduction of sub-techniques is maybe the biggest structural change that they've made over those 6 years. But the problem that led to it basically was that over time, they started to have wildly varying degrees of granularity from one technique to another. And then the solution they came up with to solve that problem was to add this new dimension to MITRE Attack, right? These sub-techniques. So let's sort of zoom in on that a little bit. So MITRE Attack increasingly had a scoping problem. Some techniques were very broad. So this is from pre-sub-techniques, and this was the old technique page for process injection. Process injection is a technique that refers to a lot, or that encompasses, like I guess you should say, there are many, many, many different flavors of process injection. And some of them are listed here below, like dynamic link library injection, asynchronous procedure calls, thread local storage, and so on and so forth. So, broad technique, MITRE Attack made the decision to bump those up to parent techniques. So process injection became a parent technique, and these 11 sub-techniques exist underneath it. And as you can see, some of these were included on that last slide, right? But also some of them weren't. Things like process hollowing were their own techniques that have now been added underneath process injection. So the idea is to like consolidate, or I guess to sort of bounce back the broad techniques and then give some more specific techniques that exist underneath them. So this next slide is claims to be a problem, but this actually isn't a problem. Like some of the techniques were very specific, and that's a good thing. Like the more tightly constrained you can keep these techniques, the more actionable they are. So a technique like RegServe32. RegServe32 is a legitimate Windows utility, but adversaries use it to execute arbitrary code like from external network addresses. So it's very specific in what an adversary would use it for. So it became a sub-technique under signed binary proxy execution, along with things like run DLL32 and MSHTA. So like that sort of gives you an idea of what MITRE Attack is from a high level, sort of the problems they started to face over time, and how they solved those problems by adding this new sub-technique dimension to the matrix. But like the question that we haven't really got into yet is why attack? Like what is the reason that anyone would want to use attack? So I think that there are 3 primary reasons that you might want to use MITRE Attack. And I think any of them counts as adoption of MITRE Attack. The first 2 are what I would categorize as the crawling part of MITRE Attack, right? And I would say that anybody can start to adopt this aspect of MITRE Attack immediately, and I would encourage you to do it for like the sake of everyone's sanity and to avoid confusion, right? And those reasons are like, attack will help you classify threats consistently, and it will help you communicate about threats effectively, right? It'll standardize the way we talk about things, and it will get everybody on the same page. Now, the next level up, and I think the primary use case for MITRE Attack, and like since those first 2 things probably go without a lot of explaining, this third bullet is what I'm going to focus most of the rest of this talk on. And that is like MITRE Attack can help you organize detection coverage coherently. Now, just to briefly touch on the 4th bullet, we also use it at Red Canary to produce a really great annual report called the Threat Detection Report. And And I'm going to use the threat detection report to talk about one half of this idea of organizing detection coverage coherently, right? As I mentioned earlier, there is this idea that I've been noodling in my head that's probably flawed, and people can, take it up with me on Twitter if they disagree. But this idea of modeling and mapping. So if you think of I'm going to use a bad metaphor here, which is a great passion of mine. But if you think of reading and writing, right? Like people write books. Actually, people read books because it enriches their lives, right? And people write books to enrich the lives of others. So if you think of this metaphor, like threat modeling is reading and threat mapping is writing. The problem is, like, if MITRE Attack is a book, it's a choose your own adventure book where you can start in 272 different places. So like the idea of threat modeling isn't as simple as just sort of looking at MITRE Attack and absorbing information from it. But to that point, like you can use Attack to expand coverage. You can use it to develop or improve detection coverage, like from where you are, whether you're starting out or like you're just recognizing the need to have better coverage over certain techniques. And I should note here that when I say detection coverage, I say that because Red Canary is in the business of threat detection. But you can take that to kind of mean like detection coverage can be the same as just sort of the coverage of your security controls. Now, as I said, like because there's so many different places you can start with MITRE Attack, the threat modeling aspect of it, or like using it to guide your threat modeling, using it to figure out which threats you need to be concerned about or where you should focus your efforts, like you might have to rely on external analysis and data, which we produce in the form of that threat detection report that I mentioned a minute ago. And I'm going to explain what that all is in a second. But before I go on, I kind of want to draw this distinction, right? And it's nuanced. Because on the other side, there's like this, so if threat modeling is the walk part, then the run is threat mapping, right? You need to be very organized if you want to map to MITRE Attack. It's particularly tricky if you have a lot of data sources or a lot of security controls that are input, that are creating security data within your environment. But the idea here is like adopting Attack to track threats, right? Analyzing and assessing your internal detection or security data and mapping it to MITRE Attack for the purpose of like creating reports, whether they're an external report like that threat detection report I'm about to talk about, or like internal reports for your leadership. So if that doesn't make sense now, I hope that it starts to make sense as I go through these slides here. But first, we're going to do a sidebar here into what is Red Canary. And I sort of shoehorned this in here, but this is an important point. Before I start talking about like how you can think about prioritizing threat techniques using MITRE Attack, I need to sort of explain how Red Canary works so that you'll understand things like our threat detection report and later how we've actually managed to map to MITRE Attack at scale. So once again, not trying to sell you Red Canary, just trying to give you some context. Broadly speaking, Red Canary is in the business of security operations. We provide both services and solutions for security operations. The primary one, the oldest one, is our managed detection and response platform. So we gather endpoint telemetry from our customers' environments. We parse it against a library of thousands of detection analytics or like detection logic that are developed by our detection engineering team in-house. Those detection analytics raise potential threats. And those potential threats are then analyzed by humans on our detection engineering team. So like at that analysis level, the detection engineers can either suppress or hide false positives, or they can confirm the veracity of a threat and ship that off to customers in what we call a confirmed threat detection. For the purposes of understanding like how our threat detection report works, there's kind of two things about these customer notifications or these confirmed threat detections that you should understand. One is that the false positive rate is incredibly low, like less than 1% to customer false positive rates. The other thing is that while these confirmed threat detections include a very wide array of information to include like everything that's happened on an endpoint from the time it turned on to the time the threat occurred and thereafter. They also are mapped to the corresponding MITRE attack techniques. So like whatever threat has occurred there, if we can map it to MITRE attack, we do. We also produce open source tools at Red Canary. I briefly alluded to this earlier. The most prominent of those is an adversary simulation framework called Atomic Red Team. Atomic Red Team is a library of scripted cyber attacks, I guess you could say, that are designed to simulate like very small behaviors that adversaries are known to leverage. So if you think of our detection analytics here as isolated bits of code that are designed to surface attack techniques, these are isolated bits of code that are designed to simulate those attack techniques. And the reason I bring this tool up is because it's also mapped to MITRE attack. And like later on, when we're talking about how we've done this mapping stuff, it'll help you sort of think about how you might be able to do it on your end. But broadly speaking, Atomic Red Team is used to like validate the assumptions that we're making about our security tooling. So like if someone tells you, oh yeah, our tool can catch lateral movement over SMB, then you go in and you run tests, you instrument your environment with whatever tool this is, and then you go in, simple copy and paste these commands into your command line that will simulate SMB lateral movement, and you see what telemetry gets generated by the tool. We also produced a wide variety of like educational community content. Like the threat detection report is one of those things. Also, if anyone is interested in like a more operational look at exactly how we transitioned from pre-sub techniques MITRE to post, this blog here, I wrote it with my colleagues, Katie Nichols and Matt Graber, and it has a great deal of good advice on how you can go about doing it on your end. Now, we're also somewhat famous for producing cool t-shirts, one of which I'm wearing right now. I also added a slide in here that had pictures of the t-shirts, but I did it after I submitted my slides. So no t-shirt slide today, I guess. All right, so let's talk about this idea of modeling in some more depth, right? How can you go about expanding your detection coverage with ATT&CK? As I said, like if ATT&CK were a book, it would be a choose your own adventure book where there's 272 different places to start. So whether you're starting to build a detection program from the ground up, or you have a detection program and you're just trying to close gaps, you need to have a plan of attack. Like I showed you that matrix earlier. There's actually a version of it right there. Oh, sorry, I'm backwards here. But like it's infeasible to think that you can just go through and address every single box in that matrix, right? Some of the techniques are undetectable, like in the sense that even if you, in the sense that you can't even get visibility into them. So like think about like rootkits that are like a result of a supply chain compromise. That you're not going to be able to get instruments in to see something like that. So spinning your wheels trying to detect it might not be a good use of time for a lot of organizations. Other things like you can detect them, but like you'll just MIR yourself in false positives. Like a lot of discovery techniques are kind of like that. And then like more broadly thinking, I sort of view this as like a T graph, right? Where some techniques are highly prevalent, highly impactful. You'll want coverage for them. Some are highly prevalent, like not super impactful, and you may want coverage for them. Some are unlikely to occur, but very bad when they do occur. Maybe you want to develop some coverage for those. And then some like are unlikely to occur and probably not a huge deal if they do occur. So those are all things that you need to wrap your head around when you think about addressing how you're going to go about using ATT&CK to sort of inform like threat modeling and detection and security control expansion. So like if you want to figure out what things are impactful, like what things you're concerned about, like you can figure that out, right, on your own intuitively. Something that's kind of harder to figure out is determining like what techniques occur most often. And that's the point of the threat detection report. And part of the reason why I explained what exactly Red Canary does is to tee this up. So as I said, like any confirmed threat detection includes a variety of information. Importantly, one piece of that information is the MITRE attack techniques associated with the threat. So at the end of the year, every year, we pull all of our confirmed threat detections and we rank and stack MITRE attack techniques to try and create a top 10. Now, one thing that we exclude from this list is detections associated with things like adware and potentially unwanted programs. We stick exclusively to confirmed malicious and suspicious threats. So, like, after we pull the data, we then come up with the top 10 list. This is the top 10 list for the 2020 Threat Detection Report, which confusingly analyzed all of the threats we observed in calendar year 2019. So, if you are an astute observer or very familiar with MITRE Attack, you might immediately recognize that you're looking at a list that includes both parent techniques and sub-techniques and techniques that don't exist anymore. Like things like remote file copy, that doesn't exist. It's now called ingress tool transfer, I think. Scripting was cut out of MITRE Attack. I didn't actually, there was another place where I forgot to add a slide, but like when we were talking about scoping issues, like scripting was maybe the greatest example of an attack technique that was too vague. It was like, I believe the term I used was, it was unsalvageably vague. So they just went ahead and dropped that, deprecated it out of the matrix altogether. Sorry, it's a bit of a sidebar. So these were the top threats we observed in 2019. And like, the purpose of me telling you guys about modeling here, hopefully, is that like if you're sitting here listening and you're wondering, okay, I want to use attack, but I don't know where to get started, like these would be very, very good places to get started. However, I haven't pulled the data for the 2021 threat detection report, which will look at 2020 calendar year threats. So like, one, this information might be sort of outdated, but two, more importantly, it doesn't align with sub-techniques. So it's going to be like hard for you to use this. So what I tried to do here was go through our top techniques and try and figure out like what are the top parent techniques and what are the top sub-techniques. So by my admittedly unscientific calculation, I suspect that if we applied sub-techniques to our 2019 data, we would come up with a top 5 list that looked something like this, right? Process injection, scheduled tasks, remote services. Remote services, I believe, is the new name for Windows admin shares. So Windows admin shares became a sub-technique. Remote services is the parent technique for it. Command and scripting interpreter is the parent technique for PowerShell and a few other pretty prominent things. So I suspect that would probably show up in the top of our list. And then, as I said earlier, remote file copy just got renamed to ingress tool transfer. So like, if your strategy for going out and starting to adopt MITRE Attack includes like trying to develop ways of detecting or observing these parent techniques, then like I would argue that these 5 parent techniques are as good a place to expand or start your detection coverage as any. Now, for sub-techniques, it was a little bit more tricky and perhaps more controversial here. So like, I'll get into this a little bit later, but mapping to MITRE Attack is kind of more of an art than a science. So I think that the things that led us to have process injection as our number 1 technique in the 2020 threat detection report were threats that were actually doing process hollowing. And that's listed as number 1 here, but it's also the threat that might not end up in the top 10 for our 2021 threat detection report, depending on how we interpret mapping, okay? So, however, I believe any one of these things would be worthwhile to like spend some time seeing if you have sufficient detection coverage for. So process hollowing, Windows admin shares, PowerShell it's a lock that's going to be in our top 10 in 2021. DL search order hijacking may or may not, depending on how prominent certain threats are. And then disabling or modifying security tools will probably be at least in the top 20. And it's an interesting one to do detection of because like, unlike most other techniques, trying to detect on like where you're trying to look for the presence of something, trying to build controls around disabling or modifying security tools is like you're looking for the absence of some signal, which is A sidebar, but an interesting one nonetheless. So, as I said, those last two slides were like my sort of ham-fisted effort to apply, to kind of translate our 2020 threat detection report to sub-techniques. A more worthwhile exercise, if we're interested in knowing what's actually been happening in 2020, is maybe to look at the top 10 malware threats we've observed in 2020 and try to like extrapolate some techniques out of them. So we'll just look at the top three. And this is also fairly unscientific, but also a little bit predictive. So you can come after me when we release the 2021 threat detection report and tell me where I was wrong here. So TA551 is a Trojan dropper. I want to say it drops iced ID, maybe some other Trojans. And some of the techniques associated with it are spear phishing attachment, which it uses for initial access. It uses a sub-technique of masquerading called rename system utilities, and it also leverages that Reg Server 32 technique. So I would not be surprised to see this masquerading sub-technique among the top techniques in our next report. Reg Server 32 was in our top 10 in the first threat detection report in 2019, so I wouldn't be shocked if that showed up. Spear phishing attachment, I don't know whether that'll show up or not, just based on our visibility, right? Like we tend to see things on the endpoint, so we kind of have to make some assumptions to know that spear phishing is happening. So we might see like Windward spawning PowerShell and making a network connection or something, but like the sort of stuff that's happening in an email system is going to be better. Like other tools are going to have better visibility into that than ours. So the second threat was CUBOT. It uses PowerShell for execution. It uses reg keys and startup folders for persistence, and then it moves laterally over SMB and Windows admin shares. I would not be shocked to see any of these three sub-techniques in the top 10 this year. And then TrickBot absolutely dominated our 2020 threat detection report. It was responsible for process injection, also domain trust discovery, and scheduled tasks. So I wouldn't be shocked to see any of these in the top 10 either, although I think we've seen less TrickBot activity in 2020 than we did in 2019. So that's kind of an idea of like how you might use MITRE Attack to model and think about like how you can coherently go about expanding detection coverage in a way that is like sane and sensible. Now let's talk about like the running aspect, right? This is the trickiest part of adopting MITRE Attack, in my opinion, right? It requires the most resources. It requires the most sophistication. So if you're going to map to MITRE Attack, which is something that we've been doing at Red Canary for probably 2 or 3 years now, the first thing you need to do is like figure out all the things that might map to MITRE Attack, that you might want to map to MITRE Attack. So for us, those things included like behavioral analytics for detection, which we've covered already, atomic red team tests. We've also covered those already. I'll show you sort of what those both look like in practice here in a couple slides, and then our research and educational content. But for your part, like maybe you have threat intelligence reporting or other reports, right? Like I said before, like maybe you're sending a monthly report to leadership about the threats you're seeing internally or externally. There also may be like charts or tables that like track the things you've detected or things you expect to detect. And then you might have like various kind of security controls, whether they're signatures or YARA rules or IOCs or alerts or what have you. For our part, like just to give you an idea of the scope of things, we have thousands of active analytics, hundreds of atomic red team tests, and I don't know exactly how many distinct sub-techniques or techniques those are mapped to, but I'm guessing it's somewhere in the ballpark of 200. So to revisit the slide just again, we parse the endpoint telemetry against our detection analytics. That raises potential threats. Those are reviewed by humans. If they if the veracity of them is confirmed, those get shipped off as confirmed threat detections to our customers, like by way of what is effectively a customer notification. So the reason I went through that again is to talk about like what are our options for mapping our security controls for our customers to MITRE Attack. So we can do it at like the detector level or that behavioral analytic level, right? So right here. The good thing about doing it at this level is that you're making your determinations about what an analytic is going to catch when you develop that analytic. So you map the analytic to whatever technique you think it's going to catch, and then from there on out, it's automatic, right? Like the detection engineer doesn't have to make any determinations when they're analyzing. It just the confirmed threat detection inherits the MITRE attack mapping of the detection or like logic or behavioral analytic that we've already developed. Now, as you might have guessed, the problem with that is that it's kind of bad at nuance. Sometimes our hypotheses about what a detection analytic might catch are at odds with what it ends up catching in reality. But it's very scalable. So like it doesn't slow down our detection process at all. Now, we could also do this at the human analysis level, which is going to be better at nuance, right? Because the detection engineer who's analyzing the event is going to have all the context to figure out exactly what they're seeing. But unfortunately, that's not as good at scale because it doesn't, well, I should say it's not great at scale because of those 272 potential sub-techniques that you have to choose from. It's just going to slow down the detection process. Paused again.
I guess we'll just.
I'm going to hit refresh.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so like the one is good at scale, not great at nuance. The other is good at scale or is bad at scale and not great at nuance. So the question you might have is like, well, why not do a mix of both? And I promise you I'm going to address that. But I'm going to address it on the back half of the slide deck after we go through like the stuff that we've learned. However, the place where we map is at the analytic level, right? Red Canary is built to detect threats. It's not a custom-built engine for doing MITRE attack mapping. So we have made the deliberate choice, for the most part, to optimize for speed and thoroughness of detection over accuracy of mapping. But even so, mapping at the analytic level gives us a pretty good balance of accuracy and speed. So what this looks like in practice, the red text here at the top is detector code. This is a detector that looks for the NL test executable, so a process called NL test, executing with a command line that includes like the words domain trusts or all trusts. And this maps to domain trust discovery. It's a technique adversaries use to make determinations about trust relationships between domains within an environment. And like if you're following along at home, feel free to copy that detector code. It is very good, at, or at least it was very good at catching TrickBot. I'm not sure if it's still quite as effective. For the purposes of Atomic Red Team, like any MITRE attack technique that we have a test for in Atomic Red Team will include, there'll be a folder for it in Atomic Red Team that will include a YAML and Markdown file that includes links to the tests. And these are just simple command line scripts that you can copy and paste into like PowerShell or command line and like do simple tests against your detection coverage. So story time. When we were producing the threat detection report, we ran across these two detection analytics. Both have to do with like the way suspicious processes might spawn from the Windows service host. It's not important that you understand exactly how they work. What is important though is like when we first pulled the numbers, we ended up with a list where the number one technique was masquerading. So to fact check ourselves, we then isolated all of the threats that had been tagged to masquerading, and we pulled a sublist of all of the detectors, the behavioral analytics that converted to confirmed threats that were tagged to masquerading. And what we found is that these two analytics, either on their own or in conjunction with one another, triggered more than 4,000 confirmed threats, which is fine. However, we then, like to further fact check ourselves, started looking at individual detections. And my colleague, Jeff Belling, who is our principal intelligence analyst, quickly realized that those detection analytics weren't actually catching masquerading. They were catching process injection. Specifically, they were catching TrickBot. So I tell that story because it kind of tees up what I'm going to tell you right now, which are like the things we learned. So if you're thinking about adopting MITRE Attack, or if you're thinking about transitioning from the old pre-sub techniques, MITRE Attack to sub techniques, you're going to face this question of like, should I assign this to a team or an individual? In the story I just told you, where like you have a hypothesis about a detection analytic, but when you apply it to the real world, it catches something that you didn't expect it to. Like, that is a problem that maybe would have been caught if a single person were in charge of all of our MITRE Attack mapping, right? So like the benefit of having an individual do it is perhaps consistency, but it's at the cost of it taking a longer time. Whereas if you assign a team, you might get it done faster, but with less consistency. So the point being there, like, it's an open question as to whether or not like every single person would have interpreted that detector the same way, which leads us to our next point, which is that attack mapping is an art. It's not a science. So if you're going to do this and you want to avoid those sorts of troubles, and I'll say like that service host detection logic problem was the most overt issue with our detection logic, but it wasn't like a completely isolated incident. Like no other issue had such a profound effect on the threat detection report, but like we were pretty sure that some of our detectors were catching things that we didn't think they were going to catch when we developed them. So creating a style guide will help. Like everyone's learning on the fly, particularly with sub techniques, and creating a style guide will enforce some consistency, right? So that'll prevent people from like using their own interpretations. Also, you should be reviewing your detector like mapping decisions continually. And definitely you should have multiple review phases the first time you start trying to adopt MITRE Attack, right? Just to make sure everyone's on the same page and to enforce consistency. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time, and I'm going to close with conditional mapping. So this is the why not both thing that I alluded to earlier. So as I've been saying, sometimes our expectations of what our expectations of what detection logic might detect in the wild are different from the reality of what they do detect. And this can be for a number of reasons, right? It can be an interpretation problem. It can just be a mistake. Or maybe you're dealing with a broadly focused detection analytic that's designed to catch a lot of things, right? By default, it's difficult to tie that to a single attack technique, whereas a narrowly focused one might be much easier to tie to a single attack technique. So whatever the case is, the idea of conditional mapping is an idea we're working on where we're going to try to identify ambiguous detectors, like for whatever reason they're ambiguous, and require human reviews of them. So in this way, like we keep the speed of mapping at the detector level for the most part, at the behavioral analytic level, but we add in the ability to review at the human analysis level for analytics that we know are problematic. I hope you all found that somewhat useful. I think we're doing a Q&A here, but I will yield to the team here at Security Weekly on that. Thank you for your time.